Hi there. In this topic video, our focus is going to be on evaluating some policies designed to increase housing supply. Here's a chart showing the age of the housing stock in England in 2012 by age and by tenure. Look first of all at the part of the stacked column showing it's shown in yellow. These show properties that are effectively more than 100 years old. In other words, they were built before the end of the First World War. And in England in 2012, nearly 20% of homes dated from before 1920. That increases to nearly a third in the private rented sector and just 5% in the local authority sector, council housing. So what this suggests is, of course, that the UK has a fairly aging housing stock, and this is one of the long-term supply issues facing the economy. How best to increase the total supply of houses? It's a big policy question. Of course, supply is a flow concept, so to increase supply we need to increase the rate of new house building. Here was a survey carried out in 2014 and 2015 asking housing developers what's the biggest barrier to you building new homes, and preferably lots of them. Quite clearly in 2015, nearly 70% of developers said that the planning system was a significant challenge to building homes and completing housing developments. 44% said there was a shortage of available land, and 41% referred to a requirement that new housing developments must include some element of affordable homes. 38% recognised the CIL as a barrier. That's the Community Infrastructure Levy, designed to raise funds for associated infrastructure surrounding new housing, for example, road improvements. A relatively small number of developers said that getting funding for developments was a problem, only 20%, and less than 10% said there was a lack of demand. Well, we know this, of course, in the housing market in the UK, there isn't a lack of demand. What there is a lack of supply. And the issue, I guess, is this, that the supply of new homes coming onto the market is fairly inelastic. There are limits and barriers to the responsiveness of the market. Therefore, if demand increases, as we show in this diagram, if supply is inelastic, prices can really go only one way, and that's upwards. To develop the analysis a little bit, if we can just make the supply curve more elastic, I've replicated the diagram on the right here and just added in a slightly more elastic supply curve S2. Well, you can see hopefully that for a given the same change in demand from D1 to D2, if the supply S2 is more elastic than S1, then we don't get the same increase in price, and what we do get is a bigger change in quantity. Quantity would rise to Q3 in equilibrium in response to the level of demand D2. So I guess the policy focus here is how can we increase the supply of housing, and also how can we make the supply of homes more elastic over time to changing demand. So let's have a go at evaluation here. The key, of course, in exam questions is to make a point, identify a policy option, explain it, analyse it, perhaps exemplify it, but then be able to offer a line of critical reasoning. And the key point, the key exam skill, is to try to evaluate the point that you've made rather than just chuck in just a counterpoint that may have little relevance. I'm going to give you 6 options for raising housing supply and offer 6 evaluation points at the same time. Option 1 is to give tax incentives to building firms to build new homes, to offer them lower taxes. For example, you might cut VAT on new properties. You might offer some tax relief if companies build on brownfield sites. In theory, this increases the profitability from building and should stimulate more investment in the housing sector. Well, the evaluation in this case is to think of an alternative, that a tax incentive in theory could work, but might there actually be a better alternative? So, for example, instead of providing tax relief if you build, perhaps we should be taxing housing developers who leave land undeveloped, so-called land banks. Another way of evaluating would be to ask a question. Okay, give a tax incentive to build new homes, but what type of homes will be built? Would they be detached homes? Would they be flats? Would builders construct enough new affordable homes for people and families on lower incomes? Second policy option is to just simplify and hopefully shorten the planning process. So effectively to relax planning constraints. The idea there is to shorten the time frame between planning, building and completion, and as we saw in the previous slide, increase the price elasticity of supply. Well, a critical evaluation point would be that if you relax planning laws, you may get some developments which are actually not properly in tune with the heritage or the community in which people live. Indeed, lax planning laws may worsen the quality of the housing stock. Third policy option is to offer some financial support to building companies. So companies may be short of funding. That might be holding them back. Subsidy might encourage housing investment when the commercial banks are reluctant to lend. Well, the problem with this policy is it's likely to be quite expensive. And as we've seen in the previous slides, actually funding isn't the biggest single factor holding supply back. Only about 20% of developers say it is. So most developers wouldn't really be affected by this. And my evaluation point is it doesn't fundamentally affect the long run issue, which is just simply not building enough new homes. Let's move on to three more policy options. One could be to end the affordable housing requirement for new build estates. So typically local authorities, when they're granting planning permission, might say, for example, that 20% of the new homes have to be affordable or available for rent or some sort of criteria. Now, in theory, this means that builders can charge, if we get rid of these restrictions, builders could charge a higher average price and make more profit per house built. And in theory, they would then build more homes driven by the profit motive. The critical evaluation point here, of course, is that builders would then have an incentive perhaps to build more luxury homes, detached properties, and actually bigger homes isn't necessarily what we need. We perhaps need more smaller, more manageable homes, particularly with an ageing population. A fifth option is to think about the supply constraints that limit housing supply. So perhaps the government might step in with some increased funding of vocational skills targeted on the skills required by the construction industry. That would be designed to lift the quality of human capital available to building firms, raise productivity and increase the capacity of the building sector. Well, an evaluation point which would be fine would be to say, well, this is okay, but it's going to take actually many years for that to have a significant effect. A better short-term policy might be to slightly be more relaxed about migration of inward migration of skilled workers. And another policy option is for the government to actually build homes themselves. In other words, to give local authorities the freedom to go to the capital markets and borrow money to build more social housing, affordable homes. Give local authorities the financial freedom. That's in theory, that should work. Local authorities know their circumstance. An evaluation point could be that if you build a lot more social housing, if you build a lot more council housing, that could cause average house prices to fall, creating a negative wealth effect. That said, of course, you could go halfway and say that local authorities could build homes to buy and build homes to rent, or you can have part buy, part rent schemes to get over that problem. But for each of these policy options, we're thinking, well, how might it work? There might be an analysis diagram there to maybe an outward shift of the supply curve. And then as part of the evaluation, we're thinking, right, let's question, let's criticise, let's challenge. What does this policy depend on? Might there be a better alternative? Evaluation, of course, is that challenging, questioning approach. You can't go wrong if you do that. So we've looked at some options to increase housing supply. It's one of the big long-term issues facing the British housing market. Thanks for joining me on this topic video.